Liliana will be panelist. So please, Pastor.
Okay. Walter, can you hear me? This is. Hello?
No,
No, man.
Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me? Yeah, we're good. Okay. Okay, great. All right, that should be much better. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Walter, thank you very much for having me moderate this panel. I think it's a very exciting panel and a very important topic. I look forward to this panel contributing immensely to the so far successful conference that you've been having here today. As Walter mentioned, the subject of our panel discussion is the use of Russian assets for the recovery of Ukraine. Ukraine is in its third year of warfare, and there have been a great pressure on Ukraine in terms of financing the effort. There are three areas of financing that have been focused upon. The first, obviously, is the military situation in Ukraine. The second one is the infrastructure of Ukraine, the financial infrastructure, I should say, the support of the social security system, of the government employees, etc. And the third one, which is increasingly coming to the fore, is the eventual recovery or reconstruction of Ukraine. So those are three avenues or roads that the financial community is going to have to look at and is looking at in terms of helping Ukraine move forward into the future. The third point, the reconstruction of Ukraine, is going to be a very heavy burden because if you look at the numbers so far, they're very high. The World Bank earlier this year estimated that it would cost about $486 billion to help Ukraine's reconstruction over a 10-year period. Now, my personal opinion, I think that's a low number. It's going to be a lot higher, I think, than that. Then if you look at the practical aspects, you could take a look at the land situation in Ukraine, particularly the agricultural land. Much of the land in Ukraine has been contaminated through a variety of logging and mining activities. So that's going to take a lot of money as well as a lot of effort to get that Ukraine decontaminated and back into useful, productive agricultural use. So the challenges are immense. The costs will be great. The issue, of course, is how to meet the costs that this challenge will present. Over the years, the international community has been very, very generous in terms of its bilateral and multilateral support of Ukraine's efforts, but there's always room for more. And one of the issues that the international community has been looking at is for Russia to take up the burden of the cost of the recovery of Ukraine. And that's a very right argument to take, and it's a very proper argument for the international community to pursue. As a matter of fact, over the past few months and more recently, the international community finally resolved this issue and has made an effort to make the assets from the Russian resources overseas available to Ukraine. If you look at it, Russian central bank has approximately $300 billion in overseas liquid assets, two-thirds of which is approximately in the European banking system. Just recently, within last week or so, the G7 and European countries made a concerted decision to provide $50 billion in loans from these assets. The assets themselves will not be provided, but the income from the assets will be provided to Ukraine to pay off the debt. So this is a first step forward. It is estimated that about $3 billion will be provided to the Ukrainians by the end of this calendar year. The majority of those funds will go for military assistance, and the remaining will go for financial support of Ukraine. And as this process unfolds, obviously, those resources will be tapped into to provide recovery funds for Ukraine's redevelopment once the war comes to an end. It is with that background that we have two leading experts on Ukraine and in the area of economic development in Ukraine. And I'm delighted that they are able to join us today to provide their perspective and then open the floor to dialogue from our attendees here. Joining us from Kiev is Timofey Milovanov. Timofey, can you hear me? Can you hear you?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
And you should be able to.
Timofey is president of the Kiev School of Economics. He served formerly as Ukraine's Minister for Economic Development, Trade, and Agriculture, and has held a number of roles with the National Bank of Ukraine. And joining me here at the table is Ambassador Kurt Volker. Kurt served as ambassador to NATO. He also served as the special representative to Ukraine negotiations from 2017 through 2019 during the Minsk peace process. Currently, he serves as a distinguished fellow at the European Policy Analysis Center. And I'm delighted that he could be with us to share his perspective. Kurt, welcome. Good to see you again. I'd like to start off with Timothy, if it's okay with you. Timothy, if you would like, take about 10 or 15 minutes to give your presentation, then we'll turn to Kurt, and then, of course, we'll turn the floor over to our attendees for questions. Timothy?
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here from Kyiv. And I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person. I hope soon the war would be over and I'll be able to visit. Well, I can visit during the war too, but it's very, very challenging. So Ukrainian damages, as you rightly point out, are about direct losses, about $150+ billion. And so these are direct damages in terms of what has been destroyed. The largest impact is housing and critical infrastructure such as energy. We're going into winter, and most of our generating capacity, which can smooth the peak electricity demand, has been destroyed. We're increasing import, and we're also basically, nonetheless, with this import from Europe, we'll face about 8 gigawatts, maybe 6 with import of a gap during the winter. This means no electricity in houses. It means cold. It means elderly without elevators, grocery shops not being operational, and so forth. It's going to be harsh. And Russia has imposed this damage. When we talk about the economic part of this, when we talk about the critical infrastructure, the housing lost, we ignore the human cost, the violation of the human rights, and also the suffering that has been imposed on people here. So, I think it's important that we do not turn just to the numbers. And we think it's very important to understand that all these damages are not just economic issue, but it's just people living through the war today. And it's very, very difficult for majority of Ukrainians to get by. No matter what we see in the news, no matter the stories about the resilience, in practice, people are suffering and have been suffering. I have a personal assistant at the Kyiv School of Economics. She's a student, first year, senior, and her village has just fallen completely to Russian forces this weekend. So she has been displaced twice already, and she has been living in Kyiv, but her village where she was born, her kindergarten where she grew up, has a Russian flag put above it, and the entire village is destroyed, a couple of houses standing. So there are these $3 billion Russian assets which are immobilized, and there is a decision to issue a loan to Ukraine, and it's a G7 promises that there's basically a statement that there is a consensus. So we read in the news that there is a loan. Currently, we are at the consensus among G7 about the loan of 50 billion. And we do not quite know how in practice it's going to be working. For now, just the European Union is going to give us funding, a loan, and there are legal restrictions for other countries to be able to do that. So the EU can do it, but it's unclear how other countries outside of the EU can do it, because in their jurisdictions, the income, the interest, which comes from the Russian assets, is considered to be the property of Russia. So the current legal situation is that there is a statement and there is a consensus that Ukraine should be paid $50 billion, and it's going to be a loan, but the loan is going to be repaid, or it's going to be guaranteed by the proceeds of the Russian assets. So the interest on the Russian assets. However, this is still legally challenging because of the reasons I have just described to you. So what is going to happen in the future? It's a little bit unclear, but at the same time, there's some information about the part that will be given by the European Union. This is about 35 billion euro. We need to sign, it's very complicated actually, we have to sign a bilateral agreements with each country, which will be giving us a loan. There is a commitment for 3 billion from Great Britain, and there is a discussion of 20 billion from the US. All this funding should be given to Ukraine between the 1st of December of 2024 until the end of December of 2027. And they will be going into the budget of Ukraine, and they will be tailored, related or targeted or tailored to the budget deficit, to the needs of the Ukrainian government. So, we'll see how it's going to work in practice. But the most important thing that the European money will be given to Ukraine until the end of 2024. And this is basically a major breakthrough. I think there is some justice in it because Russia should pay for what it has done. Now, there's an additional issue. We're talking today about Russian immobilized assets. But there's also, a related funding issue for Ukraine that in the U.S. There is the funding which should be or can be given to Ukraine, and that's a part of a related process. But with the elections, this process, we worry, can be disrupted. Okay, so that's basically where we are. There is a progress finally after 2.5 years of the war with the not confiscation, but de facto using the proceeds from the Russian assets as a collateral. And the EU can fully move ahead with that, whereas other countries still have to do some legal work. And the entire amount of 50 billion, which is, simply 1/6 of the 300 billion that I mobilized, and really, really short of what the damages have been, and really, really smaller than what Ukraine needs, because Ukraine needs about $40 billion a year, not $50 billion until 2027. But at least the EU is moving forward, and this is really good news.
Thank you very much, Timothy, for that outline. I think the debate in the West in terms of the legalities was between whether or not you can legally take the actual assets of the Russian Federation or the income. And it was decided that to move against the income or the proceeds because there was a fear that if you took the actual assets, it would stymie other countries from putting their money in European banks for fear that they would be confiscated. So that's one of the issues that I think has been resolved because right now what they're doing is taking the actual proceeds from those assets themselves. But anyway, Kurt, we'll turn to you now.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And I think Timothy outlined things very, very well, very accurately. I just want to underscore something that he said. And then I'd like to take advantage of Walter's invitation to broaden out to a couple other themes. But first, just on these frozen assets and seizing the interest on those assets. The summary is that it's good that we're doing something. What we're doing is not enough. And that is a general theme about the West's approach to Ukraine. It's good that we're doing something, but what we're doing is not sufficient. $50 billion is about 1 year's budget shortfall for the Ukrainian state budget. So we need a 50 billion every year. And this is a one-off. This is a one-off with the interest being advanced from future years. On the form of a loan that the EU is taking out, and the US can also take out to provide the money and then get paid back from the future interest. So it's a one-off, and it actually creates a perverse incentive not to seize the 300 billion, because now we need it frozen so that we can get the interest to pay ourselves back. So it's a deceptively mediocre policy. The right thing to do it would be to create the legal framework that would allow us to seize all $300 billion and use it. Now, I think that eventually will happen. I think it'll take the form of reparations, where there will be some kind of international legal process that holds Russia accountable for damages caused, and that this will be paid to them, to Ukraine, in the form of reparations. But we haven't done this yet. We have instead done something. It's useful to get Ukraine $50 billion, some of it by the end of this year, all of it by the end of next year. But it's not enough. And that's where I want to broaden out to them, because that is indeed characteristic of our policies up to now. It's been well over 2.5 years of Russia's full-scale invasion. We have done an awful lot to help Ukraine, but we've done it incrementally. We've done it slowly. We've done it with restrictions and conditions, limitations, and we continue to do so. And that is not a strategy for winning. That is a strategy for prolongation, and it is, unfortunately for Ukraine, a recipe for suffering for a long time. And it's really not the right way to do it. We have an opportunity with a US election. There will be a new president in January. We don't know who, but it'll either be Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. So there's an opportunity to have a fresh look here. And so what I think we need to do is have a comprehensive strategy for how we put enough on the table to convince Putin that it is a failing effort for Russia to continue this war and will only weaken Russia, and to strengthen Ukraine in every respect, militarily, economically, politically, institutionally. This is at a very general level what President Zelensky's victory plan was trying to get at, to have a comprehensive strategy for victory. I don't think it really did that in the level of detail that's needed. And I don't think it was terribly convincing in this capital, in Washington, or in some European capitals, but it is aiming in the right direction. We need a strategy that will actually bring a successful end to the war, not merely continuation. I would put out the following elements as to what such a strategy should be. So consider these to be the detailed points underneath the Zelensky plan, if you will. But starting economically, we should be seizing all of the frozen assets, and we should be providing them to Ukraine as reparations. And we should be using them. We should need to create a mechanism for their use, a mechanism for their distribution. And it should be aimed not necessarily at repair, although that could be part of it. It should be aimed at growth. It should be aimed at what is going to create the new Ukrainian economy that is better, stronger, faster, and able to integrate into the EU as quickly as possible. We should do, Roman, you mentioned this, we need a strategy for helping Ukraine clean up land, particularly agricultural land that has been damaged by war, that has unexploded ordnance, that has shrapnel. We need a land strategy. We need a comprehensive approach to maintaining freedom of navigation and the use of Ukrainian ports. This is something that requires a bit on the air defense side. It requires a bit on the naval side and maritime presence, if we can militarily work on the end of the war, and it requires investment in the port infrastructure, because this is the lifeline for the Ukraine economy overall. When I was in Odessa about a month ago, they had at that time 2 container ships come in, which was seen as a great success and maybe a harbinger of more container ships. Then Russia started bombing the port again, and it's set back everything. We need to take this on. This needs to be part of our strategy. If Ukraine's going to win, it's got to have an economy that is functioning well and growing, and for that they need the port infrastructure to work. And so we have to take that on as a goal. We need to do a better job at encouraging investment in Ukraine. The Ukraine recovery conferences, of which there have now been 3 major ones, Lugano, London, and Berlin, have not delivered anything, in my view. Maybe I'm too harsh, maybe they delivered something, but it has not produced a permanent executive international body focused on problem solving for Ukraine's economic recovery. It has not created a globally effective scheme for war risk insurance. There is war risk insurance. World Bank has some, DFC can provide some, others can, but it's not comprehensive. It has not disaggregated risk within Ukraine by industry and by geography to give banks, financial institutions, and investors a roadmap for what risk really is, because it's not the same throughout Ukraine and throughout Ukraine's economy. It has not prioritized the energy sector. And we heard from Jacques talking earlier about Ukraine becoming a renewable energy powerhouse, but it's not happening now. It's going to happen later. This needs to be accelerated. We need to help Ukraine solve its immediate energy issues, which Timothy mentioned very eloquently. And we need to also be helping the investment in Ukraine for its renewable energy and exporting electricity, clean electricity, to the European Union as part of one of the major ways of integrating the Ukrainian economy into the European Union. So those are all things on the economic side, which need to be matched by things on the military side. We need to, just as Timothy alluded to in the end of his remarks, we need to create a stable mechanism for assuring the level of support that Ukraine needs militarily. Going through Congress once a year with a nail-biter vote to see if we can get $60 billion of US taxpayer money is not a formula for doing this right. We should instead provide, as we did in 22, we should pass legislation for Lend-Lease for Ukraine and do it at a scale far larger than $60 billion for 1 year. We need probably $500 billion. And it is money that Ukraine would be able to borrow and be able to use solely for the procurement of defense articles from the United States. But we could put that on the table through legislation very quickly, and it would be the right thing to do to assure some stability in support for Ukraine's military, which is very important to show Vladimir Putin. Putin counts on our lack of consistency, on the difficulty of getting votes through Congress, on there not being a NATO fund for Ukraine. We have to start showing him the opposite, that we can put these things together. I just mentioned the NATO fund for Ukraine. This was a proposal put forward by former Secretary General Stoltenberg. I think it is an excellent idea. Create a 100 billion euro fund at NATO for supporting Ukraine militarily. This would be in addition to any bilateral support, and it should be funded on the same cost share basis as any other NATO funds, which is to say the US pays 20%. Right now, under the ad hoc arrangements that we're working with, the US is paying over half of Ukraine's military support. I think it would be the right thing for NATO and the right thing for the US, and even sellable to a Trump administration, to reduce the US share down to 20%, but have it there in large quantity and sustainable. We need, as I mentioned earlier, a focus on air defense. We need a focus on freedom of navigation. And we also have to start, shifting now into the third area, politically. We have to start framing the end of the war in political terms that will create a stable and lasting peace. This is something that President Zelensky has tried to do. I think he needs a lot more vocal and active US and European support for this. Because we have to not only fight the war, and we have to not only invest in Ukraine's economy, but we have to start defining the terms of how this looks when it's over. And I think it has to be Ukraine in NATO, Ukraine in the European Union, maybe European NATO troops in Ukraine for training and equipping and air defense. But we have to have a picture of what this looks like so that it deters Putin from future aggression against Ukraine. Where the boundary is of what Russia occupies and what doesn't, that's a different issue. We'll never recognize Russia's occupation. We may not be able to physically dislodge them in a short period of time, and we may need to think about other means than military. But in terms of the political structures that exist in the future, that is something we need to be proactively working on and defining so that we eventually get there. We also need to do a better job on information. And this is one that I really don't understand, because I know the Biden administration has a very clear view of what's right, what's wrong, what arguments Putin makes that are specious arguments and genocidal arguments. But we have not done a good job of communicating, both in terms of a proactive and forward-looking comment about the future. What is the future of Europe, peace in Europe, security in Europe, and Ukraine's role in that? And we have also not done a consistent and persistent job of debunking Russia's false narratives about the war, about Ukraine, about history, and so forth. We need to be doing this partly to get the third, the global South, the part of the world that's watching this from a distance, so that they understand what's actually happening here. We also need to get it out in order for the Russian people to hear it, because if they're only hearing the narrative from Vladimir Putin, they're quite confused about what's really going on. And so we should be making extraordinary efforts to get the information out, to be proactive in this, the information part of the war effort. And then the final thing, we've done a reasonable job of having Europe fairly unified, a couple of outliers, but otherwise fairly unified in support for Ukraine. But I don't think we have really pushed to create an alliance of support for Ukraine as strongly as we should. And I mean that not only formal treaty allies, but other countries around the world. We need to create the equivalent of the Gulf War coalition that George H.W. Bush created about saving Kuwait from Iraq's invasion at the time. It needs to be a global assumption that what Putin has done is wrong and needs to be reversed, and we need to be leading the ability to get an alliance of countries around that idea. We've done a fairly good job within Europe, but not quite good enough. And I do think that we were late in empowering NATO. It was only this year, 2024, for the Washington Summit, that we first allowed NATO to take on any formal role in supporting Ukraine. Up until then, the US was among countries that didn't do that. We preferred to do things bilaterally or through a Ramstein formula or some other way. I do think we need to make this much more of a NATO role as well. There's nothing that speaks permanence and effectiveness on the long term like having a NATO role, and that paves the way for ultimately Ukraine to be a full member of NATO. So we need to get that process started as well, building those alliances. So that is what I think is needed: a broad, comprehensive strategy, economic, military, political, information, and building alliances around that. And there's an opportunity. It's not a given that this will happen. It's not a given it will happen in a Harris administration. We may see a lot of continuity with the Biden administration. It's not a given that it'll happen in a Trump administration, but neither is it a given that it won't. So we have to actually start pushing and pushing for something that will actually bring resolution rather than more of the same.
Kurt, thank you very much for that overview. I think the one thing that we take away from your presentation, and unfortunately, much of Ukraine policy is ad hoc, and that's the problem with the policy. We don't seem to have a concerted, uniform policy. To put it bluntly, we don't have an exit strategy. What do we want to get out of this, and how do we want to get Ukraine across the finish line? That's a big detriment to our policy as well as to Ukraine. Picking up on a few of the things that you mentioned, however, in terms of $300 million, $300 billion of liquid assets, I share your perspective that those should be tapped into. I know now the international community is trying to make a legal distinction that you can't tap into that for a variety of reasons. I don't buy that argument. It should be call it reparations, call it punishment, call it whatever you want. Russia is an aggressor should be punished, and that tranche of money is definitely free game for the international community to take to support Ukraine. So I hope the international community moves very quickly on that in that avenue. The other thing is, going to the overall strategy of being ad hoc and everything, we've given Ukraine enough just to keep fighting, but not to win the war. And that's been the problem since day one of this thing, whether it's in terms of political support or whether it's in terms of diplomatic support, and obviously definitely in terms of the support of military equipment. The argument about the F-16s, whether they should be given those, whether they should have long-range missiles, what kind of equipment should they have? All of this just put Ukraine on the back seat all the time. They were fighting, a very defensive war. Ukraine is very capable. They're fighting for their own identity, their own territory, and they should have been given the right and proper equipment from the day one. But that's something for the historians to delve into. But we can rectify that by amending those mistakes as we move forward. So there's a lot that needs to be done. I'm glad that we were able to air a lot of these perspectives, and hopefully whether it's a Harris administration or a Trump administration, they'll listen to some of these some of this advice and move forward in a more proactive role in support of Ukraine. Having said all that, I think it's time for us to open the floor to questions. I see we have a number of students probably with us here, so I'd like to open the floor now. Yes, sir.
Hello. My question is this: apart from the current frozen assets, are there any other prospects that we could move towards during the lame duck period that could do a quick hard punch and help Ukraine now? And also, would it be acceptable to begin using economic or international kind of geopolitical pressure on those countries that don't support the coalition, which Mr. Volker referred to, a possible coalition?
You want to take that, or Timothy? Timothy, do you want to respond to that? Or?
Yeah, so I think there is a recent, just was in the news this week. Ukraine brought a civil case against a Russian government somewhere in Europe, in Baltics, I believe, and some of the Russian property owned there is confiscated. So there are definitely much more you can do to be able to put pressure and actually acquire assets. That I completely agree with what Kurt has been saying. We have done something, and this is great news, but we can do so much more. And what we have done is not enough to stop the war or deny Russia the ability to wage the war. And in fact, ironically, our sort of hesitance to do more has enabled Russia to build the entrenched war machine, which now gives it the capability to prolong the war. So this is the counterintuitive, unanticipated effect of trying to be minimalist in providing support to Ukraine. What should have happened is to give Ukraine in the first year of the war in 2022 sufficient support to push Russia back, especially when the front lines collapsed, and then secure the borders. That didn't happen, and so we are where we are, and there's no end in sight to the end of it. And some ideas of that somehow diplomatically we can persuade Russia to stop the war. I think this is a fantasy. In real world, we need leverage over Russia, and that leverage has to be strong, so that when Russia thinks differently, it still respects this leverage. Now, your question is there other leverage over Russia, and is there leverage over people or countries who are helping Russia? So third parties, and leverage is there, and this leverage could be both negative and positive, from diplomatic to political to military to legal, but that requires coordination, and that requires commitment. And the problem is that democracies are weak in terms of offering commitment early, until the conflict is sufficiently strong. That so democracies, this is, they are fantastic because they basically pluralist, and they protect from any strong leadership which can capture democracy, but it also means it's slow in acting. So I think it falls upon us to argue, to advocate for our politicians in all countries to be more decisive in Putin response to Russia. Specific tools, I mean, there are tons of them. Sanctions are working if you're willing to enforce them. They are not the only instrument, but you can also try to buy out, meaning offer some deals to some of the specific parties, bypassing of the sanctions or financing the war or recruiting a military happens by specific individuals using specific mechanisms, using inputs of specific companies. Just to give one example, there are dual use components, let's say from analog devices in the US, and they can have a much better monitoring and distribution controls so that this pathways to Russia into missiles are denied. But that requires putting a cost for monitoring. For businesses, that's disadvantages. It hits their bottom line. And so there should be either regulation or pressure. This is just one example, and you can do so much more. If China can monitor and deny supply chains to Ukraine on some critical components, definitely on your dual-use components, definitely the US can do the same for countries which use the US technology. That's just one example. There are many more.
Yeah. I'd like to comment on the idea of a lame duck period, because you hear a lot of talk about, well, we can't do this now, but in the lame duck session, we'll be able to do this, this, and this. I think that is either naive or lazy or wishful thinking, but let's look at that for a second. First off, if there's something that we should do it. Let's do it now. Second, it's not going to be easier in a lame duck period, because everyone is going to be looking over their shoulder at what the organization of power is going to be starting in January. If the Republicans take the Senate, they're not going to want to pass things in the Senate now with the Democrats in the majority. They're going to wait until they're in the majority in the Senate, and they're going to want to do that. If the Democrats are taking the House back from the Republicans aren't going to pass anything in the House now, and the Democrats don't want to. They're going to want to do it when they're in power as well. Foreign leaders are not going to do anything constructive until there's a new president to do it with. They're not going to say, okay, Joe Biden, we're going to do this for you now, as a laudatory for your great 4 years of service as president. No, they're going to wait and see, is it Trump or Harris? And then they're going to want to work with that new president. And then when it comes to the Congress passing things, again, it's going to be, what does the new president actually want? What is the new policy, if there is a new policy? Because that's what we want to organize legislation to support. So I don't buy anything really significant happening in a lame duck. And in fact, if there's anything vital that we need to do, we should be doing it now.
Let me just add one thing to what Timothy said. Timothy, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the thing you were referring to was the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague recently ruled in favor of Ukraine, awarded Ukraine $5 billion for the Russian seizure of Naftogaz assets in Crimea, the illegal annexation of Crimea. So there are avenues that Ukraine can turn to get some of its assets back and payments back. You know, whether or not they'll actually pay the $5 billion is actually open to question, but at least in principle, the mark has been set down that the international legal system is supporting Ukraine. Yes, sir.
Sorry, can I so that's a different precedent. I think there's a confiscation of property owned by the pseudo Russian government entity in one of the Baltic countries. So that's different. It's just another example, but it's the same avenue in principle. But it's basically there are assets and they have been confiscated. But it's minor. It's I mean, minor relative. It's not $5 billion. It's in hundreds of millions probably.
Hey, so I was gonna ask about, I remember hearing something about the National Guard assets that were set aside for the war on terror, I believe. What is the situation on that? Do we have any chance of getting those to help Ukraine or?
Say something?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with National Guard assets that have been set aside. One thing that I would comment on that may be related to what you're saying, though, is excess defense articles. Because we have large stockpiles of excess defense articles, particularly airframes, that we have not declared to be excess defense articles yet, and we've not made available to Ukraine, but we could do. And indeed, this is something that when we were looking at the failure of the Congress to pass new aid to Ukraine in an expeditious way, it took 6 months. That was something the administration could have done then, was take some of the existing artillery shells and other missile systems in the US inventory and declare them to be excess defense articles because they were 25 years old. And it's what we're doing anyway. We're giving them the old stuff and buying new. We could have given them the old stuff and just not be sure when the money's coming to buy new. But we could do that. So I think there is a lot in the system that could be taken care of that way.
Walter?
Since Ambassador Volker did expand it, I want to expand it two different ways because you expanded both and Mr. McVeigh is the same, as well as Ambassador you. The one is in terms of the geography, and let's say non-major NATO allies that were out there all along having all sorts of equipment that Putin was playing that NATO was involved in this war. These NATO allies could have been supplying to Ukraine even at an earlier. I was going to ask about that. But second, there's a kind of moral outrage both on the international, in the international left often about things like ecocide, questions of reparations for war crimes and so on and so forth. This question that you've done by talking about frozen assets, there are so many others, and you've also, Mr. McVeigh, you've mentioned these things about various sanctions that could still be imposed on all sorts of corrupt schemes that are going on, breakage of sanctions and so on. All of that I'm looking for a word for that. I mean, it's all involved with a kind of reparations process. In the same way as the frozen assets is a kind of reparation for the damage done. Is there a possibility that what we're missing is a comprehensive version of how we would approach what the Russians have done? You know, that approaches not only ecocide, but possibly approaches genocide on Ukraine, and say, guys, we ought to have a comprehensive approach to all of this. They've done a lot of damage. Or am I missing something?
Yeah, well, I'll just quickly say, I think that's what I was trying to outline as well, that we need a much more comprehensive approach to that. I guess one thing I left out, and next time I do this, I'll have to remember to put it in, is international justice.
Yeah.
I think that is something that needs to be part of a solution as well, because it helps cement the understanding of what actually happened. And it should not be repeated, and the accountability for people who violate norms of behavior like that. So that is an additional element, but yes, we do need that.
Because I was worried that the word reparations might be a dirty word in the thing, but it shouldn't be.
Shouldn't be,
Shouldn't.
should not be.
Absolutely not. Yes, sir. I think we have time for one more question, Walter.
My question is, are there gonna be any consequences for Russia breaking the violating the international law by having North Korean troops on their territory and actively training them right now?
Well, I would not say that that's a violation of international law. If North Korea wants to send its troops to Russia for them to be trained and to take part in conflict there, that's up to North Korea, and it appears as though they have an agreement to do this. So I don't think that's against the law, against international law. What's two comments on the North Korea thing, and then I'll stop. One of them is the most significant thing that North Korea is doing is providing artillery shells. About 2/3 of the artillery shells used against Ukraine are coming from North Korea. And if that were stopped, it would put a tremendous pressure onto Russia's war effort. So we ought to be focused on the artillery shells. In terms of the troops, even at the high end, people are estimating 12,000 North Korean troops. 12,000 is about the number of troops that are killed, Russian troops that are killed in Ukraine every 2 weeks. So this is not going to make a big difference in Russia's war effort. And then third, it is, however, striking that Russia has deliberately chosen to multilateralize its war against Ukraine. And this is something that the US, European Union, even at the UN, we should be bringing this up and highlighting what a danger this is.
Let me just add a few comments to that, Walter, before we end. In terms of the effectiveness of the Korean troops, you have to realize Korean troops have not been in a battle formation in decades, and so they're not battle tested. So the amount of value they could add to the battlefield is very small, both in terms of numbers as well as probably their training. So time will tell. But your question poses a very larger question, and this goes to something that both Kurt and I spoke about earlier about not having a concerted effort to the Ukraine issue. We've looked upon Ukraine and on an ad hoc basis, and we also looked upon Ukraine as a unilateral thing. Ukraine is a little bit broader than that. When I say Ukraine, I'm not talking about the country, so I'm talking about the Ukraine issue here. You look at what the Koreans are doing in Ukraine, you look at what the Iranians are doing with the Shahed drones in support of the Russian efforts, and you look at what the Chinese are doing. You can see that the issue of Ukraine is a multilateral issue, and the United States needs to take this kind of multilateral approach with these 4 countries being involved. Unfortunately, our policymakers are not looked upon this in a grander way to see what kind of pressures can be exerted upon these various other countries to help bring the Ukraine situation to a peaceful resolution. And that's something I hope, whether it's a Harris administration or a Trump administration, also takes into consideration. There is a concerted effort by, the authoritarian regimes to work against Ukraine. There should be a concerted effort by the Western regimes to counter that effort and put punishment on those 4 states and any other states that support Russia and its aggression against Ukraine. Well, Walter, I think we ran out of time, but unless you want to prolong this discussion, the questions are starting to get very interesting. I don't know, Timothy, do you want to add anything before we sign off?
No, I just want to thank everyone for supporting Ukraine. I think that's very important. It's the year number 3. It's very distant. It has become abstract, and you guys you care. You're true humans. As I've been speaking here, there is an air alert just outside. The very same Shahed drones are coming to Kyiv. You might have heard a little bit of a sound. So that's the reality here, and we should do everything that no one else in our lifetime experiences that that shouldn't be happening. I understand the world is getting much more volatile and unstable, but we have to resist and we have to turn it around. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Timothy, for being with us, and thank you, Kurt. That concludes our panel, and Walter, over to you.
I really do think it's a matter of getting the right people in.
It's
Down to,
That's something that you can probably.
Individuals, they understand it,
Yeah.
but
Ambassador
it's hard
Walter,
to get enough of
Ambassador,
into the policy of it.
Duke, and I wanted to thank Mr. Timothy as well. Yes, this is what I expected, and I thank you for having brought me in, and the broad reach of what we have to do, and the need for a comprehensive approach. And essentially, what you said is what we've been looking at. The West has to understand that the bad guys are now mobilizing and working out content.
Yeah.
And if we don't, it's something that we're all going to be in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
I'm a believer we need
Thank
to
you very
act
much
against
for the
this
session.
news and
We will be preparing now for our final
some
session,
pressure here.
which is dealing with another very important way of raising funds for us. We talked about the domestic possibilities. We talked about dealing with illicit funds that are out there that can be seized. Now we're going to be looking to the international institutions and bilateral partners to assist in paying for some of the recovery. And to have that one, thank you again, sir. We're going to be looking to Ambassador Courtney as a moderator, and the panelists will be Roman Patrick, alternate director at the World Bank, and John Queen, Chief Executive Officer of the Verizon Project. Mr. Queen?
I already got it set up. Yeah, I'll keep it as back. I'll give it back to you.
Mr. Queen, we've also kept everybody online. They're all here. So they need to. You'll be aware of the thing for public. I would ask the AFPC staff, do we have the, oh, they do. They're changing. This is for the viewing audience.
All right, you go for it. Yeah. Oh, good.
So,
Yes. Thank you, Walter. Yes, a long time. So we have two great panelists today. Roman Capture is the World Bank's alternate executive director for Armenia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Croatia, Cyprus, Georgia, Israel, North Macedonia, Moldova, Montenegro, the Netherlands, Romania, and Ukraine. That's the way they do these things at the bank. And earlier, he was the Deputy Minister of Finance in Ukraine and the Deputy Minister of Economic Development and Trade. And our second panelist is John Queen, who lived and worked in Ukraine for almost 15 years. He, while he was in Ukraine, helped manage 2 Ukrainian investment banks, and he co-owned and operated 12 Ukrainian biomass heat power stations. He's a trained economist and trained lawyer, although he says former lawyer.
Yeah.
Great. Let me just open with a couple of comments about what the international financial institutions are doing and private sector investment climate, which is so important for resources beyond the immobilized resources from Russian central bank and beyond what the Western governments do. So these are additional sources of funding for Ukraine. World Bank, since February 2022, the World Bank has mobilized over $50 billion in financial support for Ukraine. The bank focuses on urgent repair projects and on working with the government of Ukraine on recovery and reconstruction. Ukraine is pursuing reforms to grow the economy, attract private investment, and increase tax revenues. The International Monetary Fund has provided over $150 billion in financial support to Ukraine. IMF programs help anchor fiscal, external, and macro financial stability at a time of exceptionally high uncertainty. Ukraine's economy, in the view of the IMF, remains resilient, and its performance is strong under the current Extended Fund Facility IMF program, despite challenging conditions. A third institution that is important is the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, a little bit less well known over this side of the pond. The EBRD has provided over $5 billion in resources to Ukraine. It gives priority to strengthening competitiveness and reforming a public sector that is underperforming and inefficient. The EBRD supports adoption of best management and operations practices, and it seeks to enhance the resilience of Ukraine's society. And finally, there's the private sector, which in some respects is probably the most important. Russia's invasion presents clear challenges to attracting private investment to Ukraine, but investors continue to move forward. Ukraine offers a large consumer market, a highly educated and cost-competitive workforce, and abundant natural resources. The investment climate is burdened, however, by corruption, an unreliable judicial system, and wartime currency controls. So with this, let's go ahead and begin. Roman, start with you.
Thank you so much for inviting. It's a great pleasure to be in such distinguished audience here. Basically, in all these cumbersome titles that you read about myself, I am representing Ukraine at the World Bank Board of Directors. And previously, as was noted, I worked in the government, and before the government, I was in the private sector. So why the World Bank is important? You heard the number, the $50 billion was mobilized by the World Bank from donors, partially its own financing to Ukraine, which comprises about 40 cents of each dollar, which is coming to Ukraine, is coming through the World Bank channel. And since the full-scale invasion started, Ukraine focused and spends probably almost all its resources that mobilized domestically by taxes, custom revenues, and domestic borrowings for military. And the donor support, including the World Bank money, are used to provide essential services, such as pay salaries to teachers, to doctors, civil service, as we say, to keep the lights on in the country. And this is crucial for Ukraine resilience, because unless the state is able to govern the country, basically nothing else will matter. It would be very difficult to keep the military resistance. So how the World Bank why is this also important? Because we have a wide range of donors supporting Ukraine, basically ranging from US, which counts in tens of billions financing provided to Ukraine, to Iceland, which provides $100,000. And every dollar counts, and obviously Ukraine doesn't have capacity to interact with so many donors in a different legal settings, different financial instruments that are provided. So the World Bank is like a single entry for Ukraine to receive all this financing. So the World Bank has created the whole ecosystem of different trust funds and different financial instruments that allow to work with such a wide variety of donors and such a wide variety of financial instruments and legal framework, which is unique to each country. So few things that were like most of you probably followed the last week. There were a lot of announcements related to Ukraine financing, and specifically to the ERA mechanism related to proceeds or windfall profits of the Russian frozen assets. So 20 billion that will be US part out of total 50 billion will be channeled through the World Bank. the World Bank created a special financial vehicle, which is called Financial Intermediary Fund, to absorb these funds and later disburse for Ukraine. And why this is important, as we expect some political turbulence in the US in the coming months or year, the money which will be put to the World Bank Trust Fund cannot be clawed back. So whenever the money enters the fund, they can be disbursed to Ukraine only, and the US has no a single country authority over these funds. It will be decided by a group of donors, including and a recipient, including Ukraine. So basically, Ukraine can veto clawing back these resources. So we are ring fencing this financing for Ukraine, and together with other funds that are mobilized through the European Union instruments, this will be sufficient amount for Ukraine to cover its needs for 2025. Another important instrument that Ukraine used, and basically it already disbursed to Ukraine almost 30 billion US dollars, was a symbolic acronym, a Peace Trust Fund. This trust fund was primarily intended to finance salaries in the public services, like I mentioned, teachers, doctors, civil servants. And that was quite a unique vehicle. So Ukraine became the largest beneficiary of the World Bank globally as of end of last fiscal year, which ended in June, and partially due to this trust fund. Why it's unique? It's because of its speed. The disbursement happens every month. Every month, Ukraine reports back on eligibility of spending. So the donors, basically by end of calendar months, the donors, the World Bank disburse the amount to Ukraine, ranging between 1.5 to the largest disbursement was 3.5 billion. And by the 15th of the following months, Ukraine reports back, or the World Bank reports back to donors using the data from Ukraine on how the money were spent the previous months. So this speed and scale is unique and was never done in the World Bank history in the past 80 years, and it kept the money flowing and services being provided. So very reliable and robust mechanism in terms of accountability framework, because that was validated by the World Bank staff, is virtually present in every branch of the government. The World Bank historically interacted with different parts of the government. It also is under review by the US General Accounting Office, which is a US accountability mechanism for the government, and also 2 out of 4 Big Four accounting firm did a random sample check. So very thorough review of 30 billion spent, which provides the accountability mechanism, regardless of any potential political discussions on manipulations that funds were not could be misused. Another unique vehicle for Ukraine was created basically to leverage donor funds. This usually was used for the poorest countries when donor grant contributions could be leveraged or increased by a factor of 3. So for each dollar you contribute to this special financial instrument, the World Bank can lend to Ukraine $3. So with a multiplier of 3. So by end of this month, Ukraine will receive 4.8 billion from this mechanism that was specifically created for Ukraine. And obviously, as the war got protracted and Ukraine needed a substantial amount of financing, Ukraine mobilized, World Bank mobilized not only grants, but also loans for Ukraine. And later, some countries cannot provide loans, like Japan and UK. They provide a special type of guarantee, which the World Bank is a unique institution which can monetize, basically turn this guarantee into real money and provide it to Ukraine. So this year, Ukraine will receive 4.5 billion from Japan and 1 billion facilitated by the UK and 1 billion from UK, so facilitated by Japan and Ukraine and monetized by the World Bank for Ukraine needs. So basically, this complex infrastructure of trust funds and financial vehicles allowed Ukraine to keep finance its all critical needs in the public sector since the full-scale invasion, and it is well funded to keep financing for the 2025 in the non-military sector, and probably even beyond with the instruments that are in place and with the resources that are mobilized to the trust fund. Few unique features that I would say were, as the World Bank works in 189 countries, but few unique features that were specific to Ukraine. The first one is the government capacity. So reforms which Ukraine did after 2014 and until 2022 allowed Ukraine to scale up the government capacity to absorb funds and to provide the capacity to work with foreign money. In many countries where World Bank operates, basically the World Bank and international organizations such as UN and many others, they set up basically parallel systems where they work through NGOs or through their own channels to disperse funds. Capacity of Ukrainian government allowed to absorb funds at scale and also allowed to manage these funds all across the country. Second, I mentioned this unprecedented amounts of financing that were disbursed to Ukraine due to this robust accountability and fiduciary mechanisms that World Bank was able to set up, allowed basically to report back on every dollar which was contributed to Ukraine through the World Bank. And despite the different political discussions, not a single misuse of funds was discovered over this period. I'll briefly touch on the private sector, and then I will stop by. Obviously, not only the government, but the private sector faced the extreme shock. We saw the resilience of the companies that still operated despite the shock, but it's the security risk is priced in, and we understand that any company, even which is not under the immediate shock, it has a security risk priced in its operation. So what World Bank did has the entity which is called International Finance Corporation. This entity of the World Bank supports the private sector. Europeans has similar instruments called EBRD and also EIB, European Investment Bank. These companies couldn't, these entities like IFCs, they couldn't lend to Ukrainian companies due to elevated of risks. So we established a separate trust fund where donors contributed, and the money from the trust funds were blended with the financing of IFC to de-risk and basically to enable financing from IFC to Ukraine. So since full-scale invasion, 1.1 billion was disbursed to Ukrainian companies. First, we started with the financial sector, but because many companies, they just were short of liquidity, they needed financing, and also the trade finance, financing to small and medium enterprises in Ukraine. So almost 700 million was released through this support of the financial sector. Next, the focus was our clients in the agribusiness, especially as they needed to purchase fuels and crops, and they needed the liquidity for this. Recently, IFC supported one of the largest investment in Ukrainian infrastructure, the telecom, almost a 500 million transaction to create a triple play internet service and cell phone provider like LifeCell and Data Group. So IFC supported the French investor to make this transaction over the course of next 5 years. 750 million will be invested in Ukrainian infrastructure. That's important as we all see it, the resilience of businesses rely on this digital technologies and connectivity. Next, where IFC is working is renewables and energy, so battery storage and supporting the decentralized grid solutions for Ukraine. We obviously see that the grid will be different, and also we are working as the many companies face a shock and their assets are distressed. Obviously, lending is not easy because you need to provide the collateral, and valuations for Ukrainian companies are low. So we're pushing for more equity investments from the IFC to Ukrainian companies. Within the World Bank, there is the entity called MIGA, which is an investment insurance agency. So for these companies which are considering to make foreign investments to Ukraine, MIGA can provide the insurance in case such investment is destroyed by the acts of war. It covers not only the current assets, but also the future income that will be earned by this company. So a couple of companies signed the insurance agreement with MIGA, and MIGA has a capacity to do more. I'll stop here.
Great, that was a terrific overview. John, the private sector.
All right, well, hope my microphone's working, but
Want to get that one?
Yeah, you can
okay,
go.
That's
all
all
right,
right.
great, thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, everyone. My name is John Queen. I am from the private sector, admittedly, so I think what my view is today is I will talk through the project that I'm working on right now, and then I will explain how the international financial institutions and the bilateral partners can support and are necessary to support a project such as mine. So long story short, the project that I'm here to present today is the Bearzon Port Project. If we can go to the first slide.
Make sure the
So essentially, the Bearzon Port Project is a large intermodal industrial hub that we're building on the Black Sea. And it's in the Mykolaiv region of Ukraine, so not in the actual kinetic hot zone of the war, but it is in an area that obviously is on the Black Sea and everything that is involved with that. We are going to begin groundwork on the construction after the war, obviously, just because, as everyone can understand, appreciate, you don't want to create a target for yourself. And it also, frankly speaking, is very difficult to mobilize large amounts of workers right now in Ukraine due to the military need and the obligations that people have to their country at this time. The vision of the project is to, if you can imagine a situation after the war where Ukraine is headed towards EU accession, it's going to be dealing with reindustrializing itself from the way that the Russians have waged war in Ukraine, focused on industrial and residential and civilian objects. And our project is based on helping to support that reindustrialization by building a large tax-advantaged industrial zone attached to what will be one of the largest modern seaports with air, rail, and road modality attached to it on Ukraine's Black Sea. And we're talking about 20-meter depth seaport, which will allow Cape-sized vessels, which is the largest kind of shipping vessels. And the idea is that as Ukraine gains EU accession, this will become one of the leading ports for the trans-European network, and it will allow Ukraine and also the surrounding European countries and people that are interested to ship to the European continent to ship their products in and out in a very direct way, while also potentially producing and storing their products right on the port. If we can go to the next slide. So a general overview is we're talking about 10 port terminals, over 25 kilometers of berthing that will cover all types of cargoes, from agricultural products, metals and mining, to petroleum products. If we can go to the next slide. And because this is located 50 kilometers from any city, we're able to build something large and expansive in a way that's not constrained by kind of urban life. And so we're talking about building an industrial zone of roughly 10,000 acres, that's 4,000 hectares, which will have a tax-free regime allowing manufacturers and companies interested to produce and store their products to do so next to a large modern port without import and export taxes. And we are working, it's a work in progress with the Ukrainian government to basically figure out what the legislation of that will work on. There's many different kind of industrial zone projects being discussed in Ukraine right now. Ours is one of them. And that is a work in progress. We actually have a government agency, which I'll cover on the next slide, that's been created to support this project. And the key thing also is we're not just talking about shipping, we're talking about air, rail, and road. So we're really trying to put a big flag on the Black Sea in Ukraine that says, look, Ukraine is open for business. We're going to heavily industrialize this zone, and we're going to make it really easy and simple for you to ship your products from point A to point B and to store your products here. So we're interested in basically becoming a logistical center of choice. Next slide, please. So in terms of the numbers, and this is where partnerships come in. So this type of project obviously is very ambitious. We're slightly south of $800 million, which was staged out over 4 stages. We're currently in stage 1, which is the design documentation, technical and feasibility study, and attraction of private investors. Over 2 years is the intended life of this stage, and depending on how much construction we are undertaking, that could be up to $54 million. The numbers that are here are generated by KPMG in Ukraine, who has done a 60-page kind of commercial feasibility study for us. It's available with an NDA. We also have project teasers and different public documents that are available without an NDA. Stage 2 of the project involves the actual kind of groundbreaking work. We're not going to anticipate starting this until after the war for all the reasons that one can understand and appreciate. And that is estimated about a 2-year period with slightly south of $600 million price tag attached to it. In parallel with that stage, we're talking about building out the industrial park. And that will be over a 5-year period, but that will also start during that 2-year port construction. And that is anticipated to be about $150 million construction project. And then stage 4 is just the continuous expansion. Because we're 50 kilometers away from any major cities, we really do have a lot of room to grow, and it will grow with the flow of business. If we can move to the next slide. So again, what's the idea of this? The idea of this is to put Ukraine in an even more favorable position to extend the trans-European transport network, which is one of the key shipping networks from Baltic to Black Sea through the European continent. Again, our total CapEx is around slightly south of 800 million. Payback period 10.1 years, according to the KPMG numbers. IRR 16%, according to the KPMG analysts. And to just kind of show what type of volume we're talking about, as we reach the initial maximum loading rate based on the current design of the project, that will equate to roughly 28.3 million tons of cargo per year through the port. And we anticipate that this could increase up to 100 million as we continue to expand. So we're really talking about building something large and meaningful. We can move to the next slide, please. The current state of play is that we've created the agency within Ukraine's government called the Berzon Marine Industrial Cluster to support our project's development. That includes legislative and regulatory aspects and environmental considerations. We are working with KPMG and with Jacobs. KPMG has done a lot of our commercial feasibility study. Jacobs is doing the technical work, the large engineering company here. It's international, but based in the United States. They are going to be involved because of the scale of the project. There's a lot of environmental concerns, and there's a large amount of stage 1, which I covered on a previous slide, is involved with the technical and feasibility work that Jacobs is undertaking for us. And we are talking to DFC, and we're having some preliminary discussions with other groups about insurance and potential debt finance. DFC is graciously made itself available to talk to potential investors with us, as those arise about our project and how they could participate in it. And where we are right now is we are always in fundraising mode. So we are always actively seeking investors and or syndicated finance commitments. We're not looking to necessarily take money right now, but we're looking at commitments and strategic partners while we build out all the steps we need so that when the war ends, we can hit the ground running. Where this ties back to international financial institutions and bilateral partners. I've just described to you a very large and ambitious project that is very complicated. What are the key aspects to projects such as mine that are large and ambitious that want to be part of Ukraine's recovery to happening? And what are the bottlenecks? One of the bottlenecks is when you're talking about large reconstruction projects, or even if you're talking about existing businesses that are trying to assess strategic plans or reconstruction of their lost assets, there's a lot of technical and feasibility work and assessments that need to be done. This work is usually, it can be quite substantial depending on the size of the project. The dollar amount associated with that type of brain power that is necessary to complete that work also can be in the several hundreds of thousands or several millions of dollars. It's very slow or difficult to rely purely on private sector financing for this, for the same reason that you wouldn't rely purely on private sector financing to do all the research and development you need in science. Because the speed that private sector does that is going to be based on very short-term projects where they can see an immediate payback period. When you're talking about things with a longer payback period or with a more uncertain financial result immediately attached to the price tag, the private sector can move very slowly, especially if you're talking about a post-war environment. So the bilateral partners and the international financial institutions can play a key role in opening up more funding for feasibility studies, technical work, even beyond what's currently existing, to allow the private sector to lean in more heavily into Ukraine post-war and allow us to actually go from conceptualization to fundraising more quickly. Because if you just think about it, the money is always going to say at some point, we need to really understand the technical feasibility of this. Okay, you turn around to the people that can do that work, they're like, I need $1 million. Okay, you're not at a fundraising stage yet even. You're just trying to get the discussion going. This is the role where the international financial institutions and bilateral partners can step in and fill a gap. Secondly, after the war in Ukraine ends, which we all hope will be soon, and we all hope will be in a meaningful way that supports Ukraine's victory, I can guarantee you that despite whatever initial exuberance is expressed by the private sector, whenever you're talking about big dollar amounts and payback periods that are longer than a very kind of short payback period, you're talking about 5 years, 10 years or longer, and you're talking about large amounts of investment that's needed to meaningfully impact Ukraine's post-war reconstruction, the money is always going to sit around and be like, yeah, but when's it going to start again? Yeah, but when is this happening? When is this happening? It's great the war just ended, but how sure are we that all sides are happy with this? So where this comes is there needs to be, in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many of my private sector colleagues, a more programmatic and developed umbrella insurance policy for Ukraine beyond going to this institution or that institution and trying to do something based on existing structures. I would suggest there needs to be something new developed where maybe some of the money that is looking to be an economic Marshall Plan coming into Ukraine can be used to pay a massive insurance premium policy for the country, where you can, as a business, more programmatically come in and apply for a certain type of risk coverage or risk transfer that allows you to think more long-term and not just short-term, okay? Because otherwise you're going to have slower movement from large financial investors coming in to build larger projects. And that is what Ukraine needs. They don't just need short-term low-hanging fruit. It's very difficult to build an economy and provide better economic outcomes for Ukrainians and the country and basically make the world the way you want it to be if you're just doing everything on very short-term 3-year payback period projects, okay? It's like trying to build your 401k on $1 bills, $1 bill at a time. Yeah, it's meaningful, it works, but you want to be able to also do the larger scale, big ambitious projects. So that is, long story short, kind of my initial thoughts on everything. I've just described my project, which we think will be one of the largest, most ambitious infrastructure projects in Ukraine post-war. But like many colleagues, we all have our challenges. And if we look at the future, even if the war was to end today, there's certain key functions that the bilateral partners and international financial institutions can lean into in a more expansive way than they're already doing, which can kind of accelerate private sector money flowing into Ukraine and not sitting on the sidelines until more clarity is perceived.
Thank you, John. Well,
Yeah, just quick follow up on a few topics. First of all, I admire people like John and others who commit to Ukraine regardless of this challenging business environment and security risks. It gives hope to all businesses and to Ukrainians that once the just peace will be established, these projects will come into life and will benefit for Ukraine and for Ukraine's economy and for the people of Ukraine. But I think if one issue is to be taken from this presentation is about in the business context, it's a security risk. So security risk is priced in every business. So what John was taking is about the coverage of this risk. But if you take the cost of this to cover this risk on a countrywide scale, it's like trying to find the insurance in the epicenter of the 9 scale earthquake. So until the just peace is established, and what Ukraine really deserves is a just peace and a deterrent mechanism, it will be economically not feasible to develop the business on a larger scale and make such investments like it will. While I spoke, I wanted to make another point about the bank, because I spoke a lot about financing, but actually World Bank is also very good in knowledge. And what we are helping Ukraine is how to get out of this war stronger, and how to prepare for the changes and for economic development, for EU accession. So basically, there are 4 things that we focus right now. The first one, it's very important to keep a macro financial stability. So regardless the shock, the Ukraine should remain financially stable, inflation under control, reserves. So this provides the government the possibility to manage to run the country. And as I mentioned, we have done a good progress on that, and Ukraine is secured financially for the next year. Second, before such large investments can come into Ukraine, there is a transition period while we are fighting and still running the companies and doing businesses. And what we observe, businesses have constraints. So basically, the assets are underutilized by at least 25% in Ukraine. So what I mean specifically, let's say you have ArcelorMittal, the huge steel mill, but if they don't have a labor because their staff was mobilized, or if electricity supply is not stable, they scale down, they cannot operate. And same with many other businesses. So we are focusing to restore, to remove the constraint and to restore the basic services to the companies which already exist in Ukraine. They do not require much of additional investments, but just to remove the constraints so they can operate and generate tax revenue for Ukraine and jobs for the people. The third point is reforms for the EU integration. So Ukraine has declared its strategic objective to become an EU member. Obviously, there is a huge gap between the current institutional development in Ukraine and in Europe. So we need to build this transition, and reforms are costly. They require the money, the budget money to pay for these reforms. They require political capital. So we are helping the government of Ukraine to build the sequence and prioritize what can we do now while the war is still going on, which can bring us closer to the EU accession. And the last one, the fourth, is basically creating a level playing field in terms of productivity. Ukraine is still lagging very far behind in productivity versus any European peers and on the global level. And that lag in the theory breaks down to three parts: is the capital, labor, and technology. So capital, obviously, security risk is priced in. It's very difficult to bring foreign direct investments or any financing to Ukraine. On labor, we have the mobilization issue. Many businesses are facing shortages, but also we have a great skills mismatch. We have very inefficient labor markets. So we are supporting the government to change the labor code, which last was approved in 1976. So that's how the businesses operate right now under the 50 years old labor market regulation. And the third one is a technology. We do see a lot of this happening right now, technology diffusion, when Ukrainian companies absorb technologies from more developed countries, primarily in the military tech, but it also happens in other sectors. So we need more of that technology diffusion. Once these technologies are transferred to Ukraine, Ukraine can start innovating on a larger scale and basically come up with its own products that can go to the global markets, like Korea did, like Japan did. So now the military tech and the energy sector are the driving forces for this, but obviously we need more of that. So that's the areas the bank is helping. Now we are trying to set up a global alliance with the leading knowledge institutions like Growth Development Lab at Harvard and Growth Lab at Chicago University, Kiev School of Economics. Timothy spoke before me here. Basically to bring this knowledge and to customize it to Ukrainian, how we can make these changes and in Ukraine to prepare ourselves better for the time when we can move on with larger investments and development. Thank you.
Please start thinking of your questions, and let me ask one first for John. In Georgia, for some years, there has been planning and effort to develop a deep water port, a nuclear container port. But because it was so close to Russian-occupied Abkhazia, in fact, it's within mortar range, if you will, of Russian forces there. There was a question that if there were disputes between Georgia and Russia at some point, that Russia could fire a few mortar shots into the port, maritime insurance rates would skyrocket, and the port would be in pretty bad shape. How about your port at Mykolaiv? How do you look at that kind of risk?
But that's a very good question. I think the shortest, most direct answer is we're not within mortar firing range of anyone. So we are graciously with the Berzon estuary outside of the kinetic area. That's never been one of the hot zones, but anything can be a hot zone. I think that it really does depend on how the war ends, and it's the status of the Black Sea that is more of an issue to us. So I would say that anything you build, whether it's in within mortar firing distance of the current kind of kinetic situation on the ground or not, it can always become a target. You know, we live in a world where drones and other kind of things come from the air, and you don't need to fire them, you know, from some point or a sea vessel. So anything can become a target. I believe that our location is favorably situated on the Berzon estuary in Mykolaiv. It's kind of tucked out of harm's way there, and our fate will hang with the fate of the Black Sea. And I'm very happy to say that I'm pretty bullish on that right now, given the way that the Ukrainians have been able to handle the Russian Navy without a Navy themselves to speak of, and push them out of, push their Black Sea fleet far out of the theater of action. So I'm optimistic that as Ukraine builds a proper Navy after the war, that it will be able to kind of police its trade corridors and maybe even prevent Russian incursions that had happened prior to this war. I think that Ukraine can become a strong military kind of bulwark against Russian aggression, you know, after the war, given its experience and, you know, its its history now, unfortunately, of fighting the Russians in the way that it has and succeeding.
When Anakli was being considered, people were not thinking of the kinds of drones capabilities that exist now. So a mortar shot then is a drone shot today, so you're
Yeah.
quite right, Joe. I would offer a slightly more pessimistic assessment. That would be the best way to protect your port is for Ukraine to be able to threaten a Russian port in Novorossiysk.
I'm all for that.
Classic deterrence, if you will.
Yeah.
Questions? Walter, yes.
Mike,
Where's the microphone?
Follow up to the investors, how can we say, Nikolaev, if I'm not mistaken, Nikolaev, in the old days had a very good reputation for being shipbuilding. And so in a sense, I was going to ask you, John, this is wonderful because this is going to be in terms of things like silk roads and everything else, bringing products to Europe through a great port. So you're building a port area. But have you also, at some point in the distance, also looked for an expansion of facilities, or would your area be capable of also restoring that shipbuilding history that Nikolai had? And not only for commercial shipping, but actually for military shipping. We are lacking warships. So, is there something in the background that you've been that
I would say nothing immediate because we're still in the planning stages, but this industrial zone is kind of amorphous in terms of the types of companies that could be building there. So a shipbuilding facility could well exist there. I would say that the group that's involved with the project is very ambitious. We're not just involved with this project. We actually bought a smaller port in Ukraine last year. We're developing, we have several megawatts of renewable energy wind power projects currently operating in Ukraine that we are expanding out at this time. We have, again, we have biomass electricity projects. We have, we export several thousand tons of sunflower oil products every month from Ukraine. So I think the group that's behind the project in terms of the project sponsor is a very kind of ambitious and fleet on its feet type of thinking group. And so if that opportunity clarified itself, it'd be something that we surely could take a look at.
Okay, we have only 10 minutes left, so let's take several questions and then we'll ask our panelists to respond to them.
This might be in the same boat as the question that Mr. Zditsky asked, but considering that Romania, their offshore Black Sea land has a lot of oil, are there any plans for your port to be able to store any oil refineries, or basically just capitalize on the fact that there is a lot of untapped oil in the Black Sea, in Romanian land and possibly in Ukrainian land if like the Ukrainians go out and start looking for it?
Let me just, are there other questions? No other questions? Okay.
All right. The short story is, in terms of the port's infrastructure itself, we envision 10 berths. One of those berths will be devoted to petroleum products, liquefied natural gas and liquefied petroleum gas. In terms of Ukraine's petroleum reserves, that is maybe something for the natural resource investors to look at. I know that there's a lot of interest in kind of shale gas, or there has historically been. I do know that the coal beds in Ukraine are they have a lot of methane, so that lends a lot of, I guess, shale gas drilling type of capabilities there. I also know it's kind of technologically complicated, so it's not just simply you drill down and you can get it out. So I imagine that as Ukraine's natural resources in all forms, including petroleum, continue to be maybe developed and further honed for export, our port envisions being, a key hub for that, and to make it as easy as possible for people to store and ship their products through.
Great. Let's thank our panelists for a terrific discussion.
Actually, these I must admit that all three sessions, I mean, this is as wonderful and professional, glad that a lot of people watching. Now here online and, oh. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. I'm just very, very happy that people were watching online as well as here. These three last panels have been the most informative panels on the economic. We really have set the base on what economic recovery can look like. I especially want to thank all three of you because this was as informative as you get. This is a lot of folks at America ought to be listening to it all.
Thank you, Walter.
Thank you
Thank you
for organizing this.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
And please don't be strangers because we are going to be doing major economic conferences next year. Devoted to the recovery. Certainly.
How long have you been over there?
8 years.
So what I'm going to do is we're at a point in which I think what we're going to do is we have a taped a taped version of some event tree. And so why don't we play that to the audience?
Sure.
And then you might be able to
Wrap
come
it up.
and be able to wrap it up.
Yep.
So it's an event, and I know Paul said that it's.
Paul did say, and I've been communicating, and he just hasn't logged on yet. I don't know if he's.
Oh, that's true, because he was expecting at 4:50.
Yeah. So,
But yeah, we're a little early.
yeah.
So let's play a game.
Yeah. We'll
Right.
communicate.
And then you essentially you will wrap. Okay. Fine.
For the last 3 days. In fact, Ukraine was involved in a David versus Goliath battle against Russia that started more than a decade ago when Russia invaded Crimea. Those who read the Bible's book of Samuel know that the substantially bigger and stronger Goliath, symbolizing today's Russia, wasn't largely favored to win, but it is a
I'm gonna play it. Yeah.
I first wish to thank Dr. Wolfowitz for organizing another successful conference regarding Ukraine and for inviting me to participate as a speaker on the topic titled "The Road as President." That is why I will start my remarks by stating that today is the 979th day of Ukraine's road to victory. Since Russia launched an all-out war against Ukraine on February 24, 2022, that the Kremlin arrogantly thought would last about 3 days. In fact, Ukraine is involved in a David versus Goliath battle against Russia that started more than a decade ago when Russia invaded Crimea. Those who read the Bible's book of Samuel know that the substantially bigger and stronger Goliath, symbolizing today's Russia, was largely favored to win. But it is David who won, and fast forward, so will Ukraine. Indeed, notwithstanding the fact that Western support has been incremental and often delayed, Ukraine has not only been defending its and Europe's territorial integrity for over a decade, but Ukraine has already shattered the myth that Russia is a military superpower. This demonstrates that with truly strategic Western support, Ukraine can and will win Russia's war. Truly strategic Western support would include the timely delivery of the weapons that Ukraine needs, including those with long-range capabilities and without short-sighted restrictions on their use, to enable Ukraine to effectively protect its airspace and liberate its territories. And making an offer of NATO membership to Ukraine to ensure that Russia does not attack Ukraine in the future. At present, the stakes are very high, as the world is facing the prospect of another world war if Ukraine does not win this war. Indeed, Putin openly lamented that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, and he is determined to restore its so-called past glory. Obviously, the Kremlin cannot accomplish this consensually, which means that Russia would have to resort to force against former Soviet republics and satellites that are now NATO member countries, triggering Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty and consequently starting another world war. In his book titled Strategic Vision, America in the Crisis of Global Power, President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, as well as foreign affairs advisor to several other U.S. presidents, Zbigniew Brzezinski, gave the following very clear explanation why conquering Ukraine is such a critical step in Russia's imperialist plans. He wrote, "It cannot be stressed enough that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. But with Ukraine suborned and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire." While Western leaders still caution against an escalation of the war, the Kremlin considers that Russia is already in a military confrontation with the West, and even says so publicly. Indeed, 3 days before launching its all-out war against Ukraine, namely on February 21, 2022, Reuters reported that Putin said publicly, and I quote, "Let me explain that U.S. strategic planning documents containing the possibility of a so-called preemptive strike against enemy missile systems. And who is the main enemy for the U.S. and NATO? We know that too. It's Russia. In NATO documents, our country is officially and directly declared the main threat to North Atlantic security, and Ukraine will serve as a forward springboard for the strike." End of quote. A year later, on January 10, 2023, Reuters reported that during an interview with Russian newspaper Argumenty Fakty, Russia's Security Council Secretary and a powerful ally of Putin, Nikolai Patrushev, said and I quote, "The events in Ukraine are not a clash between Moscow and Kyiv. This is a military confrontation between Russia and NATO, and above all, the United States and Britain." And on March 27, 2024, the World Russian People's Council, chaired by Patriarch Kirill, head of the Russian Orthodox Church, proclaimed an order stating that Russia's military invasion of Ukraine is a war. And this war is not only against Kyiv, but also the collective West behind it. And that Russia and its people are fulfilling the mission of the restrainer, who protects the world against the onslaught of globalism and the victory of the West, which has fallen into Satanism. End of quote. This does not leave any room for a compromise. On May 21, 2024, the Moscow Times cited a draft resolution of the Russian government intending to expand unilaterally its territorial waters in the Baltic Sea, by shifting borders with Finland and Lithuania. This was another warning of things to come if Ukraine does not stop Russia now. Under those circumstances, appeasing Putin is not a viable option. It would be repeating Chamberlain's fatal mistake, led to the Second World War. On the tail end of his 10-year tenure as NATO Secretary General, James Stoltenberg gave a speech on September 19, 2024 at a German Marshall Fund event titled "Reflections on a Challenging Decade," and shared the following thoughts on Russia's genocidal war against Ukraine, and I quote, "We all want this war to end. The quickest way to end the war is to lose it. But that will not bring peace. It will bring Russian occupation. The paradox is that the more weapons for Ukraine we're able to deliver, the more likely it is that we can reach peace and end to the war. There can be no sustained security in Europe without a stable Ukraine, and no lasting security for Ukraine without NATO membership." End of quote. If Western leaders fully understood this message and then acted accordingly, Ukraine's victory would come much sooner and its reconstruction would cost much less. Such much needed action by the West should be financed by Russia's assets abroad that have been frozen by Western authorities to stop Russia's military invasion of Ukraine and compensated for the huge damage caused by Russia. It is estimated that the frozen assets abroad of Russia's central bank alone are worth 260 billion euros,